Hail and well-met slayers of giants. Welcome to Chapter 17 of my serial novel, Tilting at Windmills. Remember, this is a draft. There are lots of changes I'll be making to the final manuscript based on feedback from readers who've posted in the comments on Substack and Patreon. If you notice anything, from the smallest typo to the largest structural change, I will be very grateful for your notes. So become a patron of my Patreon or subscribe to my Substack, and you'll get a little reminder each week when a new chapter comes out. And if you know someone who might enjoy the show, tell them to go back and catch up with you. Tilting at Windmills, Chapter 17. The Squire Pou. Different families celebrate different holidays, even secular ones, based on their connection to whatever is being memorialized. For Benjamin and Chris, this meant one of the most important holidays of the year was May the 4th, because of their shared love of Star Wars. Chris just happened to get the day off, and Benjamin didn't take a sub-job on that day, so they got to spend the important holiday together. In the morning, Benjamin attended a meeting of the Board of Publishing Professionals Against Book Bans, then accomplished one of those adulting tasks, going into the clinic assigned to him by his insurance provider to do a pre-intake meeting to schedule the intake, which would then lead him to hopefully getting assigned to a therapist. Perhaps this was the most efficient way to distribute a finite amount of services to a population with lots of mental health needs and not enough counselors, but Benjamin couldn't help but compare it to the socialized medical system in Spain. The Spanish complain about wait times to get in to see specialists, and these gripes feed Americans' worries about universal coverage. But the fact is that the wait times are still shorter than the U.S., especially when averaging in the wait time for people who can't afford it at all. The profit motive skewed the American system in such strange ways. Not only did it incentivize denying care to people who needed it, but when it came to providing services to the poor, it created an incentive for not-for-profit and for-profit companies to grasp for government dollars earmarked for the poor by providing them services, creating a donut in which the poorest were given the most encouragement to get care, then denied that same level of care as they stabilized and climbed the income ladder, only to achieve that same kind of care if they became wealthy enough to hire someone to navigate the bureaucracy on their behalf. Benjamin was now poor enough to be enjoying the benefits of a system where providers were reaching out to him in order to try and get grant money, but a system which demanded poor people miss work in order to allocate care to people who can't afford to miss work is one which needs a lot of work. After the DMV-esque meeting, mostly paperwork filled out in a waiting room interrupted by 2 brief conversations with people filling out their own paperwork, Benjamin and Chris spent their May the 4th enjoying an impromptu trip to the beach. Benjamin associated time out in nature, especially nature which was rainy, not too hot, and visually appealing, with treatment for his mental health. And Chris and Benjamin associated long conversations in the car with good relationship maintenance, as those tended to be some of their most enjoyable times together. On this voyage, they took turns choosing songs to play, and mostly didn't torture the other with ones they knew the other wouldn't like. Benjamin didn't like country music, but could enjoy folk and pop that verged on country. And Chris didn't like metal, but enjoyed rock, which had some of its elements. So some of the fun came from playing a song for the other to find out if it was too country or too heavy, or if it could go in their mutual rotation. Benjamin wanted to go to Cobble Beach, a stretch on the side of Yaquina Head, an isthmus sticking out into the Pacific just north of Newport. A lighthouse stood on the strip of land, still working, warning ships about the sharp rocks which hid very near the surface of the water, waiting to chew up the hull of any boat that got too close. On one side of the isthmus, the natural curve of the land gathered stones up onto the beach, removing the lighter sand and tumbling the rocks with each wave, so they formed these remarkably round shapes and clacked against one another as the waves pushed them up and down in their trapped cove. Benjamin thought the sight and sound of that beach would be calming, but after the extended medical visit in Portland, they arrived just after the one road leading to the beach, the entrance to the lighthouse run by the State Parks Department, had been closed for the night. Benjamin wasn't too disappointed. He'd been looking forward to watching the sunset, still hours off, but the thick cloud cover prevented them from even identifying the sun's location, so they didn't think they'd get a good view no matter what stretch of beach they found. An overlook on the north side of the isthmus provided some cool landscape pictures of waves crashing on rocks beneath the lighthouse, and then Chris had an idea for a different viewpoint for sunset, the man-made jetty on either side of the bay, which extended far out into the ocean. They made the quick drive from the new lighthouse on Yaquina Head to the old lighthouse in Yaquina Bay. Chris had grown up in nearby Toledo, Not the Toledo, Spain, Orlando would have thought of, nor the Toledo, Ohio, Benjamin would have thought of first, but Toledo, Oregon. As they drove through Newport, Chris pointed out the multiple restaurants where she'd worked, the sporting goods store that had advertised a short-term sale on binoculars to tourists, which locals knew was emblazoned on their signage for 20 straight years, the adult video store that had been protested by religious conservatives at some point, and a number of other stores she could picture but which no longer existed, like a movie theater that was now a church. Then they crossed the bridge, an edifice which rose to 135 feet above water, about the height of a 12-story office building. Benjamin had an irrational fear of heights, which caused a jolt to run through his body whenever a sheer drop made him think he was confronting his inevitable demise. On the south side of the bridge, they descended toward sea level, passing the sign informing them they were in a tsunami warning zone. Benjamin knew this should have been more frightening than a drive across a high bridge, but this particular kind of notice made him smile and scoff. He thought of it like the warning delivered in that overly pleasant, velvety, reassuring tone of flight attendants, informing passengers that, in the event of a surprise landing, they should attempt to place their heads between their knees, because that's the most efficient way to kiss your own ass goodbye. Of course it was wise to have tsunami warning plans in place, designated paths to higher ground, sirens, etc., but at some point the high ground was close enough or it wasn't. The tsunami was too high or it wasn't, and one possessed the flexibility to kiss one's own ass goodbye or one didn't. Benjamin couldn't find it in himself to worry too much about tsunamis, concerned as he was about accidentally leaping out of a moving car and flinging himself off a very stationary bridge. They drove in a curlicue to the stretch of road leading to the last parking lot on the jetty, then continued on foot across sand dunes sandwiched between a shrinking bit of greenery and the strips of giant black basalt slabs dropped on top of one another in a row, 7,000 feet long on the north side across the bay and 8,600 feet on its south side. Originally built between 1889 and 1896, then extended in the 60s to its current length, the jetty kept the sands of the beaches from encroaching into the 300-foot-wide channel, preventing it from needing to be dredged all the time. As they walked on the dunes which had risen up off the beach onto the sides of the man-made structure, Benjamin idly wondered if the Army Corps of Engineers dredged the exterior sides of the jetty whenever they had to scoop out the middle of the channel, or if they allowed the silt to build up on the outsides, figuring it would be easier and cheaper to just add more rocks and extend the jetty when the land caught up with the end of the human construction. If it was this latter, perhaps in hundreds of years, the channel would become a long man-made river leading into a distant bay, and the beach on either side would extend out into a pair of wide man-made headlands. Of course, this all hinged on assumptions rooted in chronological bias towards the present. He couldn't know if people would still be interested in maintaining a jetty long enough to have it alter the geography so significantly, whether there would be anything out in the Pacific maintaining the fishing industry, or even if people would continue to exist for the next few hundred years. This omniscient narrator knows, of course, but a narrator must withhold facts to maintain narrative tension. Chris and Benjamin walked on the sand, not risking balancing on the rectangular boulders, but when they looked across the artificial waterway, they saw two men were celebrating May the 4th by having a lightsaber duel on the strip of rocks on the north side. They were too far away to see clearly, but Benjamin examined their swinging swords, trying to identify the colors to see which of the men played a Sith and which a Jedi. It looked like the swords were just black plastic, but Chris reminded Benjamin they might have both been wielding the black blade from the Clone Wars and Mandalorian shows. The blades clacked together loudly enough to sound like distant small-caliber gunshots echoing across the water. Chris and Benjamin both agreed the older man with the gray hair and beard made a pretty good old Obi-Wan, though his black pants and jacket looked more Sith than Kenobi's brown cloak and beige robe. Chris said she thought it would be more fitting if the other guy wore a Darth costume. His black hair was too short to pull off a Kylo Ren look, and his blue jeans and blazer sweatshirt weren't even attempting to do Star Wars cosplay. But the men's skills were impressive, and their styles seemed to be in keeping with a Jedi versus Sith fight, the younger man whacking and hammering away at the older man's sword in a fury, the older man barely moving, deflecting the attacks with as much anxiety as a Jedi knocking back an assault by a whole platoon of stormtroopers with their notoriously bad aim. The two men standing on the strip of jagged chunks of dark rock looked so cinematic, Chris and Benjamin stayed for a while, just enjoying the show. It had been almost 80 degrees in Portland, but had only risen to 52 in Newport, and the winds nipped at them from both sides of the jetty, so eventually they surrendered, went back to the car, and drove to the Burger King to get kids' meals because Chris had noticed the chain was offering tie-ins with the forthcoming Star Wars movie. Feeling they'd observed the holiday appropriately, they headed home. Serge and Rolando had been sparring at Cobble Beach initially, but when the park closed, they decided to continue on the north side of the jetty. Rolando warned Serge the terrain would be among the most difficult he'd attempted yet, but if he was willing, Rolando would entertain him with the story of Pou. Serge could tell Rolando was eager to tell the story, now that the older knight had crossed whatever internal threshold had been restraining him from doing so. And Serge figured even if he struggled because of the terrain, Rolando might be distracted enough by the story to allow a slipping and stumbling Serge to get a lucky whack at an ankle or wrist. So while the old knight entertained his creator, who visually eavesdropped from the other side of the channel, Rolando told Serge a story Benjamin didn't know and couldn't hear from such a distance.
As I said, Pou was my first esquire. As the expression goes, I knew him before he was born. I was already in my mid-30s when he came into the world. I'd known his parents. They lived in Barcelona, in a nearby neighborhood, though they were not nobility, and we moved in different social circles.
As Serge made his attempt to score a point against his teacher, and to avoid slipping on the rocks and breaking a bone or two before falling into the deadly cold water, he tried to engage in conversation, but his speech was even more halting than it had been on the slippery stones of Cobble Beach.
You never explained the whole, you being 200 years old thing. I will have you know, I am not yet 158. I was born in the fall of 1868, on a Monday, September 7th to be exact. You should commit that to memory for the sake of accuracy in the accounts you are keeping about my exploits, though I know you have not had much extra time to spend maintaining those of late. The explanation for my longer-than-normal life is going to strike you as very unsatisfying. It is a product of magic, of course. It is more complicated than that, a combination of 2 spells and the sustaining power of my familiar, balanced in just the right way. It is a dangerous and delicate spell, like a diabetic mismanaging their insulin to burn calories at an unnatural rate, but in reverse, and with aging instead of calories. Like diabulimia, this can easily kill the spellcaster. But I will teach you how to do this someday, and you can decide if you want to live for an unnaturally long time. For today, let's focus on Pou.
And then, in the midst of defending himself against Serge's blows, he managed to turn aside briefly and share a look with the bird on his shoulder, and both of them nodded at one another. Serge couldn't help but feel insulted by the way Rolando could interact with the big bird and still keep up with Serge's best attempts to hit him. When Rolando turned back to Serge, he made a slight lunge and poked Serge in the ribs, just hard enough to bruise him and push him back, so Serge had to work to maintain his balance on the rocks. As Serge pinwheeled slightly to recover, Rolando began the story in earnest.
Pou was born in the winter of 1900. It was not a good time in Spain's history. We had just lost a war to the United States, lost a bunch of our holdings in the Americas and the Philippines, much of our navy in that conflict, and it had serious consequences back home, both in economic terms and as a blow to national pride. Very much an end of the empire feeling.
I can relate. Rolando shook his head a bit, a strikingly normal reaction to be able to pull off while sword fighting.
No, the United States has not experienced anything like this quite yet. You have an empire, but you have not suffered the same humiliation. Vietnam, perhaps, Iraq, these are little tastes. But you've managed to deceive yourselves that you didn't lose, or at least that you haven't been bested by a greater geopolitical power. And this country still has not been forced to reckon with its fascism in the way Spain had to after Franco. Although, arguably, we did not do so enough. Many criminals were given amnesty in the name of reconciliation. It has led to a short memory about the dangers of fascism in my country. But the United States, you do not know how to feel defeated yet. Maybe that is part of the curse. Maybe it's just because your nation is so young. But I digress. Pou was born into this, and like many young men, he wanted to believe he was connected to a tradition of strength and glory and victory. When he was only 14, he wanted to enlist in the French Foreign Legion and go fight in the trenches in the Great War. Luckily, his parents prevented this, and the French Foreign Legion would probably have rejected him anyway. He could not pass for an older man. He could barely look his age. Even when he was in his 20s, he was often mistaken for a boy in his teens. Spain remained neutral during the Great War, though this was hotly debated. Like everything in Spain, the arguments were complex and made by strange coalitions. Those who favored entering the war on the side of the Germans tended to do so on behalf of the Catholic Church, the army, the king, the Carlists who were opposed to the monarchy because they wanted a different royal family, and the Mauristas, who were one faction of the Conservative Party. Those who favored siding with the French were the liberals, the intellectuals, generally on the political left, and the Catalan separatists on the right, along with the Idones, who didn't agree with the liberals or the right-wing Catalonians on much of anything except their opposition to the Prime Minister. All that messiness may seem irrelevant, but it explains why Pou did not join the Spanish army when he could have. He was a Catalonian from Barcelona, and didn't want to find himself forced to fight on the side of the Germans in the service to Madrid and the Spanish crown. So he found himself at loose ends, desirous of battle and glory but with no particular enemy to fight. This is a very dangerous position many a young man puts himself in. As you Americans say, scratching for a fight. Between strikes, Serge corrected. Itching. Yes, a bad place to be, wanting to do battle with no opponent. And then, one day, Pou saw something very strange. As he walked to meet with a friend who lived outside the city, he saw a man out in a field, and the man was behaving strangely, dancing and spinning. Pou left the road and walked toward the man, and, as he approached, his understanding of the situation changed. He thought the man was trying to fight off a swarm of bees with a cane. Worse, he recognized the man, a noble gentleman from Barcelona. Pou's mother worked as a house cleaner, and though she was not part of the permanent staff at the house of Santa Maria del Pi, she was sometimes brought in to help with preparations for parties. Pou's father ran a small bookstore on Carrer de Balmes, one he'd inherited from his father, and which he intended to pass on to Pou someday. This middle-aged gentleman was a frequent customer, often coming into the shop to seek new strange books Pou's father could almost never find, then remaining to talk for hours about books about knights and dragons and other things. Pou's father found the gentleman eccentric but entertaining, and he appreciated the way the man overpaid for books. Thus he did his best to remain in the man's good graces, and drafted Pou into those efforts from a very young age. Pou, he would say, "This is Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi, a great scholar and one of our best customers. He is a lord, so you should bow to him when he comes into the store." Pou, barely more than a toddler, would delight his father and his father's friend by running up and offering his best bow to the man whenever he came into the store. And sometimes Pou's mother would come home from work and tell him that Lord Rolando complimented her on her son's excellent manners, as well as her husband's efforts to find him rare books. This made Pou proud, so he had fond feelings for this man, strange as he was, who now seemed to be in danger of being stung to death by insects Pou couldn't see. He ran toward me in the field that day. As I'm sure you have guessed, I was not fighting off a swarm of bees. I was fighting 2 large orcs. It pains me to admit this, but I have committed to telling you the story truthfully, so I will acknowledge I was losing the fight. Orcs are quite strong, and I was not as experienced a fighter. One of the orcs had an axe, the other a club. I was more concerned about the axe, shiny and flashing and quite sharp, but the club, barely more than a stripped tree branch, could just as easily have killed me, and the orc swinging it was the more talented of the 2. He managed to catch me in the upper arm, just beneath my shoulder, sending me flying, and then plopped in a heap in the dirt, my arm broken and useless. I managed to get back on my feet and continued to fight, now using my left, which, as you know, is my non-dominant hand, my right arm flopping back and forth uselessly as I fought, throwing off my balance and becoming another thing to worry about, as a target I could not easily pull out of their way. The orcs did a fair job of circling me, trying to come at me from both sides, and to remain impossible to see at the same time. I kept backing away to keep them in sight. Then, when they would approach, I would spin and back away again, counting on their momentum to keep them moving a bit further away. They were large and a bit slow, so this worked, but it must have made me look ridiculous to Pou. Not like a fighter or even a dancer, but like a man stumbling one way, turning, and stumbling the other, always looking back behind him. His assumption that I was fighting bees was generous. I probably looked more like a drunk than a man fighting off bees. And how do you protect someone from a swarm of bees? What could he do other than get stung himself while he helped to swat at the insects? Yet he ran toward me, calling, "Lord Rolando, this way, I'm coming to help." And this was helpful in its own way. The orc with the shiny sharp axe decided to charge toward the newcomer. The one with the club might have felt jealous of his companion and wanted to finish me off quickly to join in the fun, so he raised up his weapon as high as he could, intending to bring it down on my head. Without the distraction of the axe-wielder, I surprised the clubbing fellow by leaping towards him, and I stabbed into his exposed throat, then cut sideways as I dodged out of the path of the falling axe. The orc only realized he was fatally wounded when I ran off, chasing his companion, and he discovered he was too light-headed to pursue me, wondered why, found both breathing and thinking difficult, and then fell forward, dead. Now we have a bit of an elementary school maths class word problem on our hands. Pou was traveling toward me at the speed of a young man, eager to help someone but unsure what he would do upon his arrival. The orc, slower than Pou by nature, ran in Pou's direction, far more certain of his plan of attack. And I chased the orc. I was faster than the orc, but I didn't know if I would catch up in time. So I shouted, "Stop! He's coming at you now!" And it was my use of the singular which confused Pou into stopping. He'd been expecting a swarm of insects, and now he looked around for some other single natural creature, which had evaded his perception, but had caused me to move about in that way in the field. Was it a single bee, or a field mouse? It was not difficult to imagine this eccentric gentleman who came into his father's store searching for books about medieval knights battling dragons also harbored some irrational fear of butterflies. Pou stopped, but he didn't run away. The mathematics got tighter. The orc charged at him. He stood there looking for a butterfly flitting his way, and I chased as fast as I could while continuing to shout, "Run, you fool! He's coming right for you!" In the orc's last few strides, it raised the axe up over one shoulder, preparing to swipe sideways, maybe to behead the boy, maybe to try to split him in half at the waist in one huge swing. Orcs love those giant shows of strength and gore, and I knew I would not reach the monster in time. So I did something one should never do in combat. I discarded my weapon. This is done in movies. Knights throw their swords or great axes or hammers or shields as though they are ranged weapons. They are not meant for this, not suited to it, and they leave the knight unarmed. So let this story prove the rule rather than my hypocrisy. When I tell you to never, ever throw a baganawatig unless you are in direst need, I have good reason. Not only will it leave you unarmed, but it may turn your powerful magical sword over to an opponent, and you probably won't do much damage anyway. You have not practiced throwing such a precious item at a target. It would be a dangerous gambit, with little chance of success. Yet that is exactly the kind of desperate situation in which I found myself. I would have been more appropriately armed if I had stopped to pick up a rock in that dusty field, but I didn't have time. I reached back and hurled the sword at the orc like a tomahawk, completely certain the throw would fail, and the boy before me would be killed. Because a spinning sword does not behave like a throwing axe. If the blade came swinging down in its rotation, it would bounce harmlessly off the creature's back, without a hand gripping it on the other side. But three convenient things occurred almost simultaneously. My familiar at the time was a cat named Paula. She was a simple black house cat. I'd chosen that form so, if anyone saw her, they would dismiss me as a strange wealthy man who talked to his cat. But cats are excellent shapes for familiars. They can jump to high places, squeeze through small spaces, and, though we don't often think about it, cats can move very fast. If you ever see a barn cat chase a wounded but still flying sparrow across an open field, you will be shocked by their speed and the height of their leaping. Paula didn't need any specific command. She could feel my desperation, and she employed this same speed to rocket past me, jump at the orc, and sink her claws and teeth into his meaty backside. Orcs are built like gym rats, big muscly glutes, and Paula, in life, had been a fan of men's butts. As a cat, she still liked to aim for them. This alone didn't slow the orc very much, but he stood up a bit straighter in surprise. Pou could not see the orc or Paula. Instead, he saw the old man from the bookstore, running at him and shouting, taking aim and throwing his cane directly at him. He ducked down just as the orc was rearing up, because of the cat latched onto its ass. This slight change in the location of the orc's target made the creature hesitate to aim the swing of its axe. And this movement and hesitation placed his head at the precise location where the sword would enter the back, point first, and drive straight through, 6 inches of the blade exiting through the orc's nostril. Though Serge's sparring could hardly make the older man move, Rolando made the raven on his shoulder flap for balance when he leaned forward to say in a conspiratorial tone, "I must admit I was relieved. Have you ever done something like making a trick shot while playing basketball? And you were very proud when the ball fell through the net, but you were also secretly aware that you had been lucky rather than skillful. This is how I felt.
He leaned back into his standard pose and continued deflecting Surge's blows.
Pou could not immediately appreciate my lucky shot because he struggled to understand what he'd just witnessed. You know, I once had a conversation with a philosophy professor, and I was complimenting his work for helping to make the next generation more ethical, and he stopped me. He said that we should not presume education makes people more ethical. It may only make them more adept criminals.
Footnote. Shout out to one of my college philosophy professors, Forrest Baird, who made this point in a class once we'd all taken on private school tuition levels of debt to find out said class wouldn't necessarily make us better people.
I wonder if the same goes for imagination. We may be tempted to presume imagination will help us live richer lives, but imagination, misapplied, may only help us deceive ourselves when confronted with information we find inconvenient. The creative mind can think around corners, but if we don't want to know the truth, we can think ourselves into 3 right turns to escape realities we do not want to face. So I mean no insult to Pou when I say he often lacked imagination, and sometimes this was an advantage. Confronted by a man throwing a cane at him, then seeing the cane stick in the air for no discernible reason, Pou gave up trying to tell himself a series of lies about what he'd witnessed, and he suddenly saw the orc towering over him, the axe slipping from its grip, 6 inches of bloody glimmering steel poking out of the front of its face. And, as you well know, you cannot put the toothpaste back into the pouch.
Tube, Serge said. Toothpaste tube.
Yes, that is better, more alliterative. Well, once Pou knew about orcs and knights-errant, he wanted to know more. All his desire to fight for a just cause easily became a passionate ardor to study as a squire and someday become a great knight-errant himself. And I readily agreed to this. I had no esquire, and Pou was clearly excited to take on the work. But there was more to it than that. Pou was...
He dared a tiny turn of his head, still keeping his eyes on Serge, but speaking out of the side of his mouth to the raven perched on his shoulder.
And still remains an exceptionally charismatic person. He had an eager, infectious smile, was generous with laughter and compliments. He was very easy to like. And he was very good at his job. He woke up early to prepare my armor and weapons, helped me dress each day, maintained meticulous records of our provisions, and saw to restocking them so we had the supplies we needed on our adventures. He took notes each day about what had occurred and what I said, then spent time each evening updating his account of my heroic feats. Cars were new inventions at the time, and he did not know how to drive. But he arranged for train tickets and ship tickets when we needed them, acquired horses when those were more appropriate, and maintained all my correspondence, a more difficult task in the days of handwritten letters and telegraph messages. You were not great, but you didn't have a chance to learn the job before you were promoted out of it, so I, as you Americans say, give you a pasta.
Give you a pass.
A pass to where?
To the place beyond being held responsible, I guess. Like a get-out-of-jail free card.
I might prefer the pasta, but that depends on the conditions of the jail, and of course, the quality of the pasta. Norwegian prison with good carbonara from Rome, I choose the pasta. A Norwegian stroganoff and a prison in Rome, I choose the pass. But I digress. I should not make Pou sound perfect. He had his flaws as well, many of which he has grown out of in the intervening years. I think you would concede he was, as you Americans say, a firehead.
Hothead, Serge corrected.
Yes, he wanted to fight more than was necessary, often perceiving slights to my honor or to the honor of the Lady Nuria, where none existed.
Did he get to meet the Lady Nuria? She must have been pretty old. Suddenly Rolando left the rock upon which he'd balanced, launching forward and jabbing the dull point of his sword into Serge's stomach twice, then smacking him much harder than usual on the meaty part of his bicep, before delivering a small, stinging tap to the side of his neck, he used to show Serge he would have just been killed in a real fight. Serge stumbled, slipped, and fell between the rocks, bruising a calf on one leg, a thigh on the other, and receiving his first laceration suffered during their sparring, a long, rough, but shallow cut along his back.
Rolando retreated to his rock. "Let us refrain from discussing the Lady Nuria while we are sparring. Her greatness and beauty inspire me in battle, and I do not want to harm you unnecessarily or mistake any idle words for slights to her honor, which might cause me to become as fire-headed as Pou used to be."
Serge hissed at his injuries, but refrained from cursing directly at the old man, not quite sure he was safe from a second similar attack. Rolling and clambering back up onto the top of the rocks, he said, "Okay, let's take a break from the sparring for the day, and you can keep telling me the story of Pou on the drive home."
"Yes, this is wise."
The men tight-roped their way across the top of the jetty back to the safer sandy beach. Serge rubbed the sore spots on his legs and rolled his shoulders to feel the extent of the injury on his back, though he wouldn't fully appreciate it until he sat back into the driver's seat in his car. They'd retrieved the 2008 Toyota from long-term parking and had left the rental there, never properly returned to the rental company, just in case the police from Nebraska really were connected with a large enough network to find them through the rental's plates. Rolando returned to the story almost immediately because he felt guilty for Serge's injuries and preferred to fill the silence with his own voice rather than feel justly scolded by Serge's winces.
"As I said, Pou was not perfect. In addition to being a firehead, he was also a chauvinist, and I admit I enabled his machismo with my laughter and tolerance. I expect anyone my age regrets some of the beliefs we held in our youth, comments we made, jokes we laughed at. Pou associated the bravery he admired with masculinity, and often described the cowardice he abhorred by associating it with women, and I laughed at this, and I did not challenge him, much to my shame. He did grow out of this attitude eventually, of course, but not in his human lifetime. And despite this disrespect for women, or perhaps because of it, he was also frequently overcome by lust, trying to woo and bed many of the women we encountered on our journeys. I would chide him not on the grounds that the women deserved more care and consideration than to be notches on his bedpost, but that his lust was a distraction, and that chivalry called him to be chaste, or at least a little more chaste than he was trying to be. He would reply that he had to sow as many of his wild oats as possible before taking his vows, since he planned on being perfectly celibate once he became a full knight. So, rather than being concerned, I was greatly relieved when Pou met a woman and fell in love with her. It is a bit of a convoluted tale, but an enjoyable one with a happy ending." He turned to the raven on his shoulder. "You do not mind if I tell this story?"
The raven cawed some words in Catalan, which Serge could not understand, but Serge could tell from the bird's tone and the way he lifted his beak in rapid, inverted nodding gestures that Pou was eager to hear his master's rendition and encouraged him to continue. Rolando explained to Serge, "He wants me to give you the detailed version, as it was one of the happiest times of his life. As was often the case with our adventures, we had insufficient information, just rumors, and traveled to investigate. In this case, we heard about a village in Cambodia, where some magical monster had been plaguing the people, sneaking into their homes, stealing food, waking them up with strange and frightening noises in the night." Rolando tapped the breast of his coat, pointing to the little booklet inside. "I had theories, of course. This was long before the days of international air travel, so the journey involved ships and carriages and tuk-tuks, and a great deal of travel on foot. But we eventually made our way to the town, then began exploring to see if we could track the monster. Once we arrived in the village, we interviewed some locals, and learned of the most recent attack. We found small footprints leading us from that location to a clearing in the jungle. We approached with great caution, not sure what kind of creature we would find. We heard her before we saw her, a moaning interrupted by screams and then babbling in Khmer, which neither of us understood. I cast a spell on Pou and myself which would allow us to understand the speech and to communicate with its user as though we were native speakers." "That's a convenient spell."
"Yes, a wonderful spell. And, interestingly, not that different from the teleportation spell. The opening of doors in both cases. But even when we could understand her words, they made little sense. She was yelling, it seemed to us, about the rain."
"The rain?"
"Yes, like, 'Rain, how could you do this to me? I believed you, Rain. I trusted you. What will become of me without you, Rain? How will I survive? I cannot go on like this, shamed and abandoned.'"
As you can imagine, Pou and I were perplexed.
We still did not know if this sound came from a goblin or a gremlin or some local magical creature we'd never encountered before. And then, when we espied her, we were still not sure, because she was in such a terrible condition. She had the shape of a human woman, but her long black hair was ragged and wild, with leaves stuck in it, and she let it cover her face. Her clothing was filthy and torn, and she'd covered some of the holes with homemade patches of different colors without much care. As we got closer, she grabbed 2 big handfuls of her hair, parted it like a veil to reveal her face, and returned to screaming. She was feral, and I found her quite frightening, but Pou surmised she was not a magical creature at all. "Madam," he called to her, "our apologies for bothering you, but you seem to be in a great deal of distress. This is my master, Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona, a great knight-errant. I am his humble esquire, Pou, also of Barcelona. We are charged to rescue maidens and assist the downtrodden, and I doubt it is coincidence that we have discovered you in your time of need. How may we serve you and right the wrongs done to you?" The woman calmed, but only briefly. "Good squire and good sir knight," she said, "I appreciate the generosity of your offer of aid, but you have come too late. Nothing can be done for me. I am ruined. Ruined!" And then she went back to screaming. This all struck me as very unproductive, so I knocked her out. "What?" Serge almost shouted. "I used a sleep spell, and then Pou and I carried her back to the village. The people there recognized her, though they had not seen her in a long time. Her parents lived in the village, but had no idea their daughter had been the creature breaking into homes and stealing food and simple items, like the needle and thread and fabric for the patches. Well, they cleaned her and nursed her back to health. They informed us she'd left the village for a nearby large city many years ago, and they had no idea she'd returned. She'd been sending letters and money to her parents until quite recently, and then all of the communication came to a stop, and they'd feared the worst. They were very grateful to have her back, but when she awoke, she saw them and covered her face and began to wail once again. I found this very upsetting, and I offered to make her sleep for another day, but Pou managed to calm her down, and she told us her story. Her name, we learned, was Dara, which means star, and is a common name there. He pronounced the name in his best Khmer, with a softer sound than an English T at the beginning, something between an L and a D, and with the stress on the last syllable. Not like the English Laura, but like the note of a song held a little too long for an English name. She had moved to the city and found work in a factory which made shirts and pants, which were sold in foreign markets, a fairly common job for young women moving from rural areas to urban ones in Cambodia. And Lara caught the eye of the factory's owner, a man named Philang, which means rain. You see, we had not understood her because my translation spell worked too well, giving us the meaning of the man's name such that we didn't understand it was a name at all. Philang had wooed Lara, giving her expensive gifts and promises of the kind of life he could afford her, and making vows of his great love for her. Lara was quite taken with him in return, but she was a modest woman in a culture with a high degree of shame, so she told him she would need the permission of her parents and a formal wedding in her small village. This Philang fellow could not wait. He assured her that if they married in a quiet ceremony there in the city, he would travel with her back to her village to meet her parents, and when they arrived in a fancy car and he lavished everyone in the town with gifts, her parents would be more than happy to give their approval to the marriage. I was so stupid, Lara said. I believed him, and I feared if I continued to refuse, he would change his mind. So I agreed. They married in secret, and Lara was eager to return with her new husband to her village and be introduced as Mrs. Philang, the wife of a wealthy and successful man, and make her parents very proud. But Philang, as you say, sewed hems and hay. Hemmed and hawed, Serge corrected. Rolando stopped walking and frowned. What does this mean, hemmed and hawed? Serge both hemmed and hawed before admitting, I have no idea, but that's the phrase. Footnote: this expression has nothing to do with hems and clothing. It comes from two distinct words for hesitation. The first, hem, is verbal hesitation, as in ahem,
and is more obvious in the modern British variant of the expression, which is hum and haw. The word haw refers to physical hesitation, as in stopping and starting while walking. As far back as the 1600s, people were putting them together into a single phrase to describe people acting in an indecisive way, hesitating in speech and action. Serge did not know this, but now you do.
The men continued to the car. Then this Flieng fellow went on a business trip to an even bigger city in another country, Bangkok in Thailand. There he met a much wealthier man who owned many factories. This wealthy man had a daughter who was single. He was impressed by Flieng and wanted a way to break into the Cambodian market, so he floated the idea of a marriage between Flieng and his daughter to cement a business relationship. Flieng did not mention that he had a wife back home, and his prospective business partner did not ask, presuming Flieng would do whatever needed to be done in order to make himself available to such a business opportunity. And Flieng did. He returned home and informed Lara coldly that he was going to move to Bangkok for the period of a standard engagement, marry, and return with his new bride, and Lara had to leave the city without a trace before his return, or he would have her removed by force. Of course she wailed and begged him to stay with her, all to no avail. He left for Thailand, and she packed her few belongings. She had no idea where to go, and in such times of distress I think it is normal to stumble back to one's family and childhood home. Only she was too ashamed to show her face there, and reveal she was a discarded woman. So she had taken up residence in the jungle. By day she would hide out and long for her own end, but at night she would be overcome by fits of madness. Enraged by the injustice of her experience, she lashed out at the people she assumed would reject her, entering into the village at night, breaking things, stealing food, and causing a racket. But if anyone came out of their house to see her, she would run back into the jungle to hide. When she'd awaken in the morning, she'd have only a vague memory of the foray, though the physical evidence of the stolen goods and the minor injuries she suffered when cutting herself on pottery or a splintered wood would tell her she'd done something terrible, and this would only lead her deeper into a spiral of shame. When Pou learned of this, he was outraged. He begged me to take up the maiden's cause, to escort her to Bangkok to confront Flieng, then to murder him. This plan to murder a man, even one who had done such a grievous wrong to Lara, seemed a bit extreme to me, but I agreed to escort her to confront her husband, thinking perhaps we could convince the man to return with her and attempt to make amends to his wife. In retrospect, Pou's plan may have been better. What kind of life would Lara have had with such a terrible man? But I was still locked in a mentality acquired in my culture and age, which dictated that a marriage is eternal, regardless of the misery the two people subject one another to. And Pou, ever the hothead, yes, the most heated head, believed the only way to rescue her from this man was to make her a widow. Luckily, things turned out well for her. But first, we had to interrupt a wedding. And there, in the ballroom of a luxury hotel in Bangkok, Pou would meet the love of his life. He raised his eyebrows in a bounce of mischievousness. Ah, you thought he would end up with Lara, yes? No, it gets better.
If you're excited about this project, please subscribe on YouTube or like and share on TikTok or Reels or whatever app you're on now. And if you're willing to support me as I craft this novel in serial form, please consider supporting my Substack or Patreon. Each week I'll give a shout out to some of those patrons, but there weren't any new ones this week, so please tell a friend about the show so I have more people to thank next week. If any of you listeners are creators and have something to plug, please email NotAPipePublishing at NotAPipePublishing@gmail.com so I can mention the correct thing when I give you a shout out. See you back here next week for Chapter 18 of Tilting at Windmills. Teaser: Pou and Rolando rescue two maidens in distress. Then Pou dies tragically, then becomes a bird. It's a lot. Come back next week and we'll see if it all fits in one chapter.